Welcome back. So our first learning objective is understanding how customer journeys are designed. And to really get that concept, we really have to explore what a customer journey is and then also how we can design and improve them. So this video is going to be around the overall concept of a customer journey. So let's just go right in and think about what this is and learn these definitions here. All right, so a customer journey is the complete end-to-end experience that a service customer has with one or more service providers and or their products through touch points and service interactions. So it's how the customer or user engages. It's how they can see what the service provider is doing and the level at which a service provider is allowing them to see within their organization. Okay, so with the customer journey, and we start talking about digital services, and think about your own experiences. It really is about how a service is delivered, and it's just as important of the how as to the what is delivered. We have so many choices these days. Think about your mobile phone and the plethora of apps that are there. And you may try certain apps and you think, oh, this is great, but if something is clunky or not working right, we're going to find another app. So people are very fickle these days. Our customers and users, they have so many choices that we have to ensure as service providers that the choice, when they choose us, that is the best choice and we are meeting their needs. So, just understanding every touch point and interaction is also not enough. The service provider has to kind of put themselves in the shoes of that user, of that consumer, and understand the overall experience. I'm going to point out table 1.3 in the CDS volume. I did not replicate that table because it's just an example, but as you go through and read the DSV book, this is an example of how an incident is managed when you start thinking about the customer journey. I would look at it and start associating with those kinds, or that kind of thinking, and that line of thinking. Okay, we're going to look at that customer journey in just a second. If you understand the customer journey, then the service provider can truly maximize stakeholder value through co-creation. Remember, it is co-created. The customer, the user, the stakeholder, they have just as much responsibility as the service provider in the creation of value. And then secondly, the service provider is going to have a focus on the experience of that consumer and not just on the outcome that was produced or even the output that was produced. All right, so here is table 1.1, and this is the steps of the customer journey. The part that I'm going to focus on here in the video is this first column, because frankly, that is what you need to know. So when we're at the explore step of the customer journey, we're really trying to understand the markets and the stakeholders and what are their expectations. When we engage with that stakeholder, we're trying to develop and foster a relationship. When we're at that offer stage, we're really shaping the demand and what services that we're going to offer and under what conditions. When we agree, we're aligning our expectations and we agree to the conditions of that service and how it will be provided. When we onboard, we're getting that customer or user stakeholder on board and or offboarding that customer so they can leave the journey. The co-create step is about providing and consuming the resources for that service that you've engaged, and then realize the last step is around capturing value and then the improvement cycle. Now, you can read the second column. It just goes into some more detail. But if you are going to remember anything, that first column is a good one because it really tells you everything that you need to know and you can extrapolate the rest. So what does this really look like? So let's go ahead and look at the diagram that we have for the customer journey. And here it is. here's our steps, right? Explore, engage, offer, agree, onboard, co-create, realize. Yippee, there we go. Now we have the engagement of the customer and the service provider, but we have to look at two areas here. There are touch points and interactions, and those are shown by this wavy line. As the customer goes on their journey, that they will engage with that service provider, and quite frankly, the service provider will engage with that customer. This area that has been called out very slightly, it's a dotted red line, and it goes into the customer space as well as going into the service provider space. Understand that that line is basically a boundary, and it's saying the service provider can see into the customer up to that line, and then the resources of the customer beyond the line are the customers, and they're known to the customer, and vice versa. So the customer can see into the service provider to the line, and then the resources, capabilities, etc. of the service provider that are behind the line are only seen by that service provider. So we call this dotted arrow the band of visibility. So this is what the customer can see. This is what the service provider can see. And we'll come back to that as we go along, but it really is relevant when we start talking about the touch points and interactions. So just really briefly, that band of visibility, it's the activities and the resources within a service relationship that are visible to both the service provider and the service consumer. Okay, so that's what they're sharing, and that's what they can see. All right. So why do we want to master the customer journey? This is another one of those good tables that you're going to want to remember and mark. And this is table 2.1 out of the DSV volume. And there's a table like this at the beginning of each chapter within DSV, and it is about each step of the customer journey. And they all have the same first column here, where it's looking at the facilitation of outcome and experience, optimizing risk and compliance, and optimizing resources and minimizing costs. That's exactly what you want to happen in a service relationship. We want the outcomes. We want to manage risk, and we also want to optimize our resources and minimize the cost. And so there's going to be two different viewpoints between the consumer, which is in that first column or the second column, and that service provider. Make sure you look at these tables. So for example, the customer journey is to facilitate an outcome and an experience. And from the consumer's perspective, we want to get optimal service value and experience from that relationship. We want to solve our need. Okay, we want to get to that outcome and saying, yes, value has been achieved within this relationship. From the service provider perspective, we want to identify the potential products and services that will meet the needs of a specific consumer. So we need to identify and understand what those needs are. So we want to optimize those services. We want to ensure that that customer journey is fluid and easy and meets the needs of the consumer, so that both parties realize value. And I'll let you review the rest of this. It's common sense, but you have to wrap your head around, let's think in this manner. Okay. So let's continue on. This is another diagram from the opening chapter of the DSV book. And what it's doing is really stating that there are multiple value streams that a customer will engage. It's rarely a one-to-one relationship, and it's rarely just one provider per customer. So if you look at the customer journey for customer A, notice that they're getting supplies or services from service provider B as well as service provider A. So the value stream is going to depend on the interactions and the handoffs between various service providers, as well as various value streams. So it's never just that really simple, oh, here's my customer, here's their activity, here's my customer, here's that activity. It's not that simple. So we have to think beyond and look from that outside in perspective, so from that view of the customer into the service provider to truly understand that service. And I think this is a diagram that is truly important, because this is where customer and user experience is formed. And it's the perception of that consumer, that stakeholder. It's the perception of that stakeholder to the service provider, their brand. It's their perception of that customer and user journey or the service environment. And all three of them together will create that overall customer and user experience. So what exactly is customer experience? Well, here's the absolute definition. It's the sum of the functional and emotional interactions with a service and the service provider as perceived by the service customer. So you ever go out and look at the apps in your app store, and you see some people just love them and some people just hate them? It's their subjective perception. And so you never know what it is that will create that negative or the positive response. And then you take the gamble of saying, okay, I really believe this. And you go out, you get that app and you bring it back in and you start using it and you're like, oh, I'm going to be on that negative side. And this is why, right? So it is that functional and emotional response. Then user experience is exactly the same thing, except it's applied to a user. It's the sum of the functional and emotional interactions with the service and a service provider as perceived by a user. Okay, so we have to remember that functional. So what are the activities that we're actually doing? And then how do I engage them, or how do they impact me from an emotional perspective? And so I have to be able to take that into account. So, when you look at those stakeholders, you do have to view them from an end-to-end perspective. That stakeholder value is a composite of the functional, again, the capabilities, the social, and when we talk about that social interaction, we're talking about, well, when they engage, how does it help them do their jobs? How do they engage with their consumers, perhaps? And then also the emotional dimensions. So we need to understand fully almost the personality of that stakeholder. And I think the word personality is perfect at this place, because once we do know this, then we can define that customer journey via a set of personas, which are characteristics that we can apply to a group. And then we can put those personas into a scenario and then work on how will that persona work within that scenario. From there we can say, oh, we have found that perfect scenario, and so now we can create the journey map. And from the journey map, we can create the service blueprint, and that service blueprint becomes the service that we will deliver in the future, that actual functional service. It is all about that end-to-end experience. We have to look at it from end to end. It's not just, here's the technical components, they're all operating in the green, here's the access to them, good luck, I hope it works for you. We can't do that anymore. We can't afford to. Okay, there's too many providers doing the same thing that we're doing, and if we don't do it better, we don't have a customer base. So we've used the terms touch points and service interactions a couple of different times, so let's go ahead and define them formally. And so a touch point is any event where a consumer or a potential service consumer has an encounter with the service provider and or its products and resources. So what we want to do at these touch points is identify every place and time that a consumer may encounter the service provider, its products, or its brand. And that becomes a touch point. That touch point then is, we look at the entire journey end to end and say, How is it that that consumer is engaging? Then the service interaction piece is the reciprocal action between the service provider and the consumer that co-creates value. So those service interactions, and you should remember this from your foundation class, it could include the transfer of goods. It could be the provision of access to resources. It could be an indirect contact with that service provider via a component or even a third party. It could be joint service actions. So whatever it is that you're delivering, that is the interaction, is what does that consumer get, okay? Or what are they receiving? And what is the expectation that they're getting that allows them to do and create the value proposition or create the value that they want to achieve?